Great. Okay. So again, welcome everyone. We are thrilled to be with you today. Thank you for joining the first partners briefing for the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience. My name is Erin McDonald, and I have the honor of leading the federal plan and the interagency effort that developed and supported the work that is something that we're going to talk about today. So we're thrilled to be with you today to provide the briefing and have a diverse complement of federal and external partners that are joining today. Importantly, we hope and look forward to this being the first of many opportunities to engage together. So our agenda today, I'm going to provide a quick few remarks in terms of how we're going to use the hour. So we're going to dive in and hear from Rear Admiral Reed, who's going to share welcoming remarks and provide an overview of the federal plan's origin and the importance of the work. We're then going to hear perspectives from a complement of federal leaders who are champions for the federal plan and for building equitable resilience and thriving through their work. Each of the leaders represents a federal department that has been part of the interagency body that continues to build the work related to the plan. We will then hear from one of our civil sector partners, Becky Payne, who was critical in seeding the federal plan and the complementary efforts that continue to grow across the civil sector. And finally, we're going to talk a bit about next steps and opportunities to keep the conversation going after today. So our goals for the briefing are included on the slide, a few important support pieces of information to engage today. So for anyone that would value using the closed caption option, that is available to you, and you are welcome to select that button through your Zoom link, and you will have that appear on your screen. Second, because we have so many things to go over, we are not going to have time to do a live Q&A, but we would like all of you to share your thoughts, your reflections, your questions in the Q&A function that's available through Zoom, and we will absolutely follow up after the briefing and hope that you share your reflections as we go through the course of the conversation. So with that, I'm going to introduce our executive champion for the federal plan, Deputy Assistant Secretary Rear Admiral Reed. So Paul, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Erin. Can you hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Again, I'm Paul Reed. It's absolutely my pleasure to be with you all today and be a party to this introduction, at least overt introduction of the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience. This does represent our first time to openly engage our external partners. It's not to say we haven't had conversations all along with this, but this represents the first open forum for that. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm going to try to be succinct in my introduction and presentation of essentially the origin story for this work, because I think it offers a great deal of context for you to understand and appreciate what our subsequent speakers are going to bring to the conversation in terms of the application, the implementation of this federal plan, and the underpinning of it, which is the framework for the vital conditions for health and well-being. But before I get into my slides here, and Erin's going to have to play catch up as I speak extemporaneously, but she's well practiced at that. So, but before we do the slides, I wanted to offer a couple of rhetorical questions to kind of bring us to the mindset that was the genesis of this work. And those rhetorical questions are a few. First of all, what if the federal government aligned all of its resources toward outcomes that enhance resilience in communities? And what if there were a common lexicon or language that was shared by civil society and government that accurately defined the needs of communities and the resources of government to meet those needs? And what if there were an equitable and efficient way in which organizations supporting communities could identify resources within the federal government that best met the needs of the communities they serve? And what if the government uniformly measured its success in terms of elevated resilience in communities across all dimensions that define healthy, thriving communities? Now, while those are rhetorical questions for us to consider up front here, I imagine that they were at top of mind for the variety of interagency partners that came together in a work group back nearly 2.5 years ago now. Becky Payne was a part of that, as were a few of you on the line, I'm sure. The story behind that is at the early onset of the pandemic, and you can go to the next slide, I think here, Erin. It was recognized, and I've said it before, I'll say it again here, in a very prescient way. It was acknowledged that recovery from this pandemic was going to take a form and a function that looked very differently than even some of the largest scale disasters our nation has ever known. So underneath the National Response Coordination Center, the Task Force on Mitigation and Recovery was asked to entertain what exactly that recovery was going to look like and what the demands from the federal government were going to be potentially. Again, thinking very abstractly and differently from what other national level disasters had implicated. And then beyond that, and again, in a very prescient way, that task force was asked to entertain the question, what would it take for the federal government to build back to a level of resilience that was greater than what we knew to be true in 2019, recognizing very early on, even in the spring of 2020, that the level of resilience in this country wasn't going to cut it. And that certainly wasn't going to be adequate in light of the burden that the pandemic represented. But it also represented a degree of resilience that wasn't going to suffice going forward beyond whatever period of recovery was and is demanded through the pandemic. So the task force developed a small working group to think about those two questions, those two big, bold questions. And deliberated on how we could move forward and how we could evolve the federal government through the period of recovery into a period of long-term resilience building, and what it would take. What are the ways in which government could act differently in order to achieve those bold outcomes. What you see here is a depiction of the timeline of the measurement of how the American public was feeling about itself. In terms of its degree of well-being and resilience. And what's depicted on the right side of this graph is intended to imply that we've got a great deal of work to entertain over a long period of time to elevate the resilience of the nation, both in the minds of individuals and communities, as well as in maybe through some practical measures that we can perhaps touch on a bit. Next slide. Again, it was a balance. We don't want to ignore the fact that there are, and we're continuing to do this today, that there are important recovery efforts that will always be implicated on behalf of the federal government in service to the nation, but that wasn't adequate enough, and we need to go above and beyond that, and we need to sustain that effort towards resilience building over a much longer horizon than we've ever known in traditional efforts of recovery. Next slide. And you can go ahead again and next slide. So what were the considerations of this group? And I apologize, I wasn't a part of the group at this stage of the game in 2020, as Becky and others were, but I should probably offer an explanation for that. This effort has come to my office as of January 2021, following the work group's efforts in 2020 under the auspices of the National Response Coordination Center and then subsequently the Joint Coordination Cell. And that was because it needed a long-term home for administrative support ongoingly, which we have continued to do here in the Department of Health and Human Services and the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health. But I should offer the caveat also that this is by no means a health or HHS activity. It was then and it remains a whole of government perspective and effort, which will become evident as we continue to have the conversation today. So the work group, in deliberating on these questions in 2020, determined that there were a couple of considerations that had to be paramount, one of which was this involved all of us. And the Venn diagram here is to represent that. That it really is a public-private partnership to build resilience across this nation. But particularly with regard to what the implications were on the federal government, they asked hard questions of what it meant to get the house in order. And if you go to the next slide, this is meant to kind of very in broad terms depict what exactly the federal plan is intended to do. It's asking, how can we apply all of those resources across the federal government, including ones having to do with current response and recovery, but also those, and more importantly, those of steady state. How can we best apply them? Through what lens should we be looking at the outcomes of those efforts? And that's what the federal plan intends largely to do, provide a lens through which agents across the federal government can entertain how they best apply their resources towards the same meaningful outcomes that ultimately define increased resilience. Next slide. But it wasn't just a matter in the minds of this work group to entertain how best the federal government can do that independently and in a vacuum, as if that wasn't daunting enough, but how also it should be done in harmony with civil society. And as the case it may be, or was, civil society was already thinking in these terms and had been even pre-pandemic, to the point where you see depicted on the left side of this slide, Thriving Together, which is an initiative across civil society, which Becky Payne, I'm sure, is going to speak to in some fashion, that was intended to better orchestrate civil actors, non-governmental actors towards enhanced resilience in communities. In recognizing that that effort was ongoing already at the time in the summer of 2020, and the publication of the Springboard at that time, the federal government's interagency work group working on this effort intended very deliberately to build out the federal plan over the ensuing months and years now, in such a way that it could harmonize with that civil society effort. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that may look like at this point. In fact, you're going to hear some stories, I think, that are going to suggest ongoing efforts that are manifesting it as we speak. Next slide. Oh, I should point out on that last slide, on the right, there's also a nod to the fact that as this work was going on, and by the way, it was going on in an apolitical way at the level of senior career folks. Those were the members of the interagency work group that were deliberating on all of this and working to develop the federal plan. Despite it being apolitical in that sense, it does very much harmonize with a number of subsequent executive orders and cross-governmental efforts that have occurred in the current administration. And we speak deliberately to that as we talk about it today. Next slide. This slide is really worth emphasizing because I think it represents a truly unprecedented set of activities. Whereas under the NRCC and the task force and its early work group, there was a relatively small cadre of folks that were pulled from across the interagency to deliberate on those questions I mentioned. That quickly grew, and it grew rather organically to the point where today we have 44 agencies represented into the effort of this interagency body, with many, at one point as many as 140 different senior career folks having some degree of effort into the development of the plan and its implementation. And I think that number is well above 140 as we speak today. And you can see the diverse representation into this work. Everything from the National Endowments of the Arts, who you're going to hear from today, to transportation, to the myriad of agencies within HHS, and many, many more. I think that speaks to the nature of the work. I think it speaks to the resonance of why the plan is so important across government and across sectors of society. And again, I think my colleagues are going to amplify that message throughout the hour. Next slide. And then there's some really important elements to this that are emphasized that I'll just quickly point out here. Whereas historically, less emphasis may have been placed on the perspective of communities into the way in which resources of the federal government are developed and the authorities in which they're able to be applied, this plan actually calls for that front and center, which is probably one of the most important elements of it that I want to share with you today. It also offers that shared lexicon and the common framework, such that the wheels of government, the various corners of government, are all able to think and speak to this in the same terms, to create that harmonization of effort, to hopefully build efficiencies in the way in which government delivers on its capabilities, but also to set the stage for that harmonizing of the federal government and its work with that of civil society, with that of many of you on the line today. Next slide. So underpinning what the work group sought to achieve in developing this federal plan to help create recommendations for the way in which government can evolve its work is the framework for the vital conditions for health and well-being. And my understanding is, while a landscape analysis was conducted by the work group in looking to various frameworks that could be leveraged, this ultimately is where they landed, and with good reason. First of all, it's the basis for the framing of the parallel effort that was occurring in civil society that we now know to be the Springboard. But also, the way I think about it, it is a very encompassing, very inclusive, and very inviting framework for all sectors. And that we may be able to compare and contrast that with others if we had time today. But suffice it to say, it offers that opportunity for all corners of government and all corners of society to recognize their relationship into this framing. It also is positive. It's proactive and it's constructive in that it looks to define the actions that can be taken to enhance resilience through these different components that you see here. And in a fashion, it may look very familiar to you. If those of you are not familiar with the framework itself, it may resonate in its familiarity with the social determinants of health framework. But I would personally argue, and I think it's been argued by many others, that this offers a more inclusive and open relationship to those sectors that traditionally haven't been involved with SDOH necessarily. Next slide. And I mentioned it briefly up front in one of the rhetorical questions, and I'll kind of emphasize the point here. Probably one of the things that I find most fascinating about the work that's been achieved is the mapping of many, probably well over 1,000 at this point, various resources within the federal government to include the buckets that we've defined here of resources that the federal government employs. A mapping of all of that to these vital conditions, which creates that opportunity for communities in need to define their requirements in a similar fashion, leveraging this lexicon of the vital conditions framework, and readily trace from those requirements to the resources that exist within the federal government. And perhaps we'll have some time to talk about exactly how that can be achieved and the tools we're working to develop to allow for that transparency and that efficiency in accessing. Next slide. These are the main objectives, and they speak for themselves. I mean, ultimately, what these objectives are set to do is enhance that equity. The equity, as you see on the bottom there, in terms of access to federal resources, and more importantly, and most importantly, equity in terms of outcomes for communities and individuals. Next slide. Real briefly, in terms of what the thing is, the federal plan, and we won't have time to go into this great detail, and I encourage you, and I think Aaron's going to speak to the opportunities for you to follow through on the details of this. I encourage you to turn to the web pages we've developed that outline the specifics of the federal plan, and you'll have a much better sense of what exactly it means. But I will say this, the primary audience for the federal plan is the federal government. It's agents from across the government, such that they can pick it up and they can use it as that lens through which they entertain how best to apply their resources towards those outcomes. It suggests 78 recommendations, not applicable to all agents, but applicable to all of government, that could be applied to slowly evolve and mature in the way in which government applies its activities without demanding additional authority, without demanding additional finances or statutory authorities. Simply rethinking the way in which government executes its current activity to more meaningful outcomes. That's where these recommendations are best applied. And again, for any agent in any corner of government, there's reference in here to something that could be done differently. Next slide. And this is just meant to depict how this work is being taken up organically already by federal government and partners outside of federal government. And I'm going to let a number of smart people on the phone speak to that in their own terms. But suffice it to say, I think if we didn't do anything going forward, this would have a life of its own. Without Aaron's efforts and the efforts of the work group, which are ongoing and profound, frankly, my firm belief is if we just left this out there, it would be taken up readily and it would make a difference of its own accord. It's not to say we're going to stop generating effort on our own part to advance this and continue to expound on it, but it really is creating a life of its own at this point. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back to Aaron. Or actually, I think my job is to introduce Victoria Brown and offer her the floor. Victoria is coming to us from HUD, and it's one of our many wonderful partners. Victoria, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, Admiral Reed, and thank you, Aaron and Becky, and those at HHS who have been leading this effort. I am excited to be here because I know that my first introduction to the Federal Plan for Equitable Long-Term Recovery and Resilience was actually just through the clearance process. I found out that our teams had been working alongside those across the federal government, as Admiral Reed described, for this long couple of years that we've been in this administration, kind of working our way out of this pandemic. And I was so impressed by the quality of the work that the federal teams had put together. I've been in this space a long time and seen a lot of development around place-based efforts and thinking around how you kind of tackle the whole needs of community and individuals within that community. And I saw this wonderful kind of culmination of all of that intelligence and work that folks have been doing across the federal government to contribute to this framework. And I found that very inspiring. So I'm excited to talk about how it connects to the work at HUD and how much we've learned this effort and what we hope to do with it next. So one of the things, like we've said, that's so special about this plan is the collaborative way that it came about. It really exemplifies the whole of government approach that this administration has been taking across so many areas. The passage of major legislation during the Biden-Harris administration, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the American Rescue Plan, have created these historic funding investments across the vital conditions for health and well-being that provide the guiding framework for this plan. And if we can keep these ideas around equity and resilience front and center as we execute on those funding opportunities, I know that communities are going to come out more whole on the other side of this. And so I'm really grateful that we have this kind of framework to think about how humane housing might be connected to folks' opportunities to build meaningful work and wealth. So we're just kind of thinking about those through points as we put together our programs in our individual silos in a much more holistic way as a result of having been part of this effort and having this framework in front of us. One area that's really at the fore for HUD as an opportunity for interagency collaboration is housing as a platform for health. The inclusion of humane housing as one of the 7 vital conditions aligns with what we know about housing as an important social determinant of health and well-being. HUD is well positioned to support health at every stage of the life course, serving more than 10 million people each year, including children, older adults, and people living with a disability. We've seen this kind of whole of government approach that orients around collective goals in a number of different places. HUD is the co-chair of the PAVE task force, which is working to evaluate causes, extent, and consequences of appraisal bias, and to establish a transformative set of recommendations to root out racial and ethnic bias in home valuations. I think you see the through points on the vital conditions and the potential for the outcome in this kind of example that HUD's taking sort of the leadership on in terms of a whole of government approach to a fundamental component of equitable long-term recovery and resilience. We have some other areas that I just want to give a brief mention. We've been partnering with transportation on thriving communities. We've been thinking with the White House about rural prosperity networks and how we can bring our whole of government lens to that effort. We also continuously think about humane housing as that really critical component of these vital conditions when we think about our work on homelessness. And this administration has been really front and center in thinking about a housing first approach, illuminating the evidence-based practices, and presenting a call to action for the housing stability that people and families experiencing homelessness need to really thrive across all those other areas. With so much interagency collaboration and coordination happening, the importance of this federal plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience has never been greater. I think we've been called to take a whole of government approach to a lot of challenges in this administration in a recognition that none of us can do it alone. And this gives us kind of a North Star on how to organize around those interagency partnerships. I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of equity and resilience at the core of this framework. So I'm really proud to serve with an agency and administration that prioritizes equity and resilience. The programs and tools we have at HUD are leveraged to assist communities design their own pathways toward resilience and create equitable communities where everyone can thrive. It really resonated with me that the plan has belonging and civic muscle at its core, because at HUD, we are well aware of the importance of community voice to effective and equitable housing policy. Explicitly naming resilience was very critical to developing well-being as a nation. Resilience, I think, is a helpfully adaptive term. So we know it can refer to climate resilience. We just published our first ever climate action plan to center environmental justice and support communities to adapt and be resilient to climate change. But we're also thinking about really resilience in more flexible ways. So one thing that's really important to our secretary is financial resilience and the importance of building pathways to that long-term sustaining meaningful work and wealth as that's sort of a core vital condition of this framework. HUD's Family Self-Sufficiency Program builds assets for HUD assisted households and is the nation's largest asset building program. Earlier this year, we published an economic and asset building agenda alongside that FSS funding announcement that outlines some of the key accomplishments of this work as asset building tool for renters and as a reparative tool for economic justice. And we kind of see some of that work stemming from what we've learned in this framework, being able to call out those greater aspirations of each of our individual programs. Of course, we're far from perfect. So this framework also gives us the opportunity to see where we're falling short and to dig in deeper across some of these different platforms. We've even, looked at some of those institutional opportunities to embed. So for this year, our NOFO process, which is our competitive grant making process, we embedded racial equity preference points into that NOFO for the first time ever. And we'll see the effect of that in years and decades to come as we see these funding grants kind of center that work in a different way. So lastly, I just wanted to talk about how this aligns with HUD's priorities. The vision that Secretary Fudge kind of laid out for HUD really spans a lot of the different vital conditions. We're talking at HUD about expanding access to affordable housing and rental assistance, increasing housing supply through building preservation and innovation, boosting wealth building and home ownership opportunities for all, ensuring that communities can prepare for and recover from disaster and extreme weather equitably, combating homelessness with the urgency it requires, and making our agency easier to navigate so that the people that we're trying to help, that our help reaches those who need it most. So all of these core components can be applied through the framework. There are countless intersections for me to highlight, and I know we have a limited amount of time. I'll just wrap by saying that HUD sees itself in multiple areas of improving the vital conditions that complement the federal resources, support community and individual recovery, as well as improve health and well-being. We're excited to strengthen our work in the context of the federal plan for ELTRR. And we should think about our partnerships at the local and regional level across these agencies and across those public sector, non-government sector listeners who are joining us to see how we can promote those elements of the plan and the vital conditions for the health and well-being framework in all of our communities, federal and local together, to really emphasize those vital conditions. So I'm excited for the rest of the conversation. I know my colleagues at other agencies have some really great work to highlight. And I'm honored to hand the floor over to one of my cohort mates in the Presidential Leadership Workshop, Veronica Vanterpool, who's joining us from U.S. Department of Transportation and the Federal Transit Administration. So I will hand it over to you now, Veronica.
Thank you so much, Victoria. It's really an honor to have Victoria introduce me. As she just noted, we've completed a presidential leadership workshop together. And one of the goals and outcomes of that wonderful opportunity is to really foster collaboration and coordination across different government agencies. And we see how that's certainly coming together with the synergy in our work between the Department of Transportation and, of course, Victoria's agency at HUD or department at HUD. Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's discussion about the federal plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience, and to share an example of how the Federal Transit Administration has initiated a whole-of-government approach and framework to ensure individuals and communities across the country can thrive. Our mission at FTA is to improve America's communities through public transportation. While we may have different missions, the ELTRR reminds us that we are all working to improve America's communities and that we need each other's thought leadership and partnership to accomplish this goal. I will spend time towards the end of my remarks featuring FTA's whole of government framework called the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility, CCAM, to resilient and thriving communities. But first, I would like to share 2 FTA-supported resiliency projects that sustain thriving communities and show the different facets of FTA's work to build resilience and recovery in communities. Next slide, please. During the worst days of the pandemic, transit systems, particularly our bus systems, continued operating to ensure people could get to essential jobs, healthcare, and other services. Buses did the heavy lifting of helping people move, even at considerable risk to operators and other frontline workers. Transit agencies learned a lot from that time. COVID changed ridership patterns on transit, and for some cities and communities, those patterns are changed forever. Many agencies seized an opportunity to reassess service delivery and priorities. Since then, we have seen many transit systems launch bus system redesigns to better serve their customers, from cities such as Miami to Kansas City to right here in the DMV region. In short, reevaluating systems, which might result in a system redesign or other tweaks to service, builds resilience, ensuring that as local leaders look into the future, their transportation systems will be used and valued. Resiliency builds nimbleness so we can respond and recover from disruptors faster and more efficiently. Much like the federal plan for ELTRR emerged as a COVID response, so did today's thinking in public transportation. Next slide, please. My second story about resilience comes from Staten Island, New York, where earlier this month, the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority reopened a new transit maintenance facility built to be more resilient than the last. It's been 10 years since Hurricane Sandy struck the New York metropolitan area. I've lived most of my life in New York, and I remember the unprecedented images of flooding and destruction in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. One transit casualty was MTA's Clifton Yard, the only maintenance facility for the Staten Island Railway. The Staten Island Railway is an above-ground rail line serving more than 14,000 riders a day. The Clifton Yard was literally swamped with a 6-foot storm surge, threatening the daily maintenance of the rail cars thousands of people rely on each day. Just a few days ago, on December 7th, New York MTA opened an entirely rebuilt maintenance facility with 21st century technology that can now handle once unfathomable water surges, all thanks to support from FTA. This work demonstrates how we are investing in transit infrastructure and improving how we serve riders in New York and throughout our nation. FTA contributed $200 million to the project, applying Sandy relief funds to not only repair the damage caused by the superstorm, but also to build, fortify, and protect against similar damage in the future. Next slide, please. Now turning back to the federal plan for equitable long-term recovery and resilience, FTA is glad to be a federal partner lifting up this work through the Coordinating Council on Access and Mobility, again known as CCAM. FTA leads this federal interagency council to improve access to transportation for people with disabilities, older adults, and individuals of low income. And we are very happy to have HHS be a part of the CCAM team. In fact, speaking of collaboration and coordination, I want to thank Admiral Reed for inviting me. He was a participant in one of those agencies around the table when FTA launched this at our department headquarters early November. And from that discussion and collaboration, the admiral invited me to participate. So again, just fostering continuing engagement, collaboration, and relationships. CCAM is a strong government model. It is funded by 11 federal departments and 29 agencies, all doing important work together in one body to help people gain access to all of life's opportunities. FTA's CCAM focuses on coordinating transportation services across the many programs provided by federal agencies. For example, we created a guide that highlights how potential grantees can apply for federal funding and use it as their local match requirements on transportation-related projects, effectively making the project up to 100% federally funded. This guide examines how grading works in 61 eligible programs, all of which are administered by CCAM agencies. And thanks to the work done by CCAM and the transit agencies we support, we can create more of those options while saving important taxpayer dollars. Next slide, please. In October, CCAM adopted a strategic plan, which guides the group's work for the next 4 years. And this is a picture from that launch. And you'll see the Admiral at the sort of left of the blue screen there. The plan sets forth goals such as promoting safer, more accessible transportation networks and provides a roadmap for how to get there. The plan reinforces the importance of coordination at all levels of government, as well as supporting organizations. For example, a project in Ohio is making public transportation easier to navigate and more efficient in 4 counties by launching a regional transportation resource center. The center, which will serve as a one-stop hub for trip scheduling and mobility management, will coordinate trips for approximately 40 transit providers. That just adds so much ease to those who are seeking to travel around these 4 counties. Known as the Mobility Ohio Project, it represents a collaboration with 14 state agencies and is supported by a $2.8 million grant from FTA. Next slide, please. The CCAM's core values, transportation, equity, accessibility, mobility, affordability, reliability, and safety, underlie our approach to help people access everyday destinations. These are not values unique to FTA. They are shared with you, our federal partners, and other stakeholders, but they reflect the value and feedback from partners and constituents during working sessions and listening sessions over a period of time. In the spirit of coordination and collaboration, we reached more than 150 participants from 30 federal agencies and 60 national, states, and local organizations. Our conversations reinforce that every aspect of the transportation process needs to be accessible. For example, one stakeholder said he hoped every day that all metro elevators would be working so that he could get to and from work. Others shared that affordability and schedules limit an individual's ability to participate in public transportation, especially in rural communities. With the goals, activities, and measures in the strategic plan describe the work the CCAM will complete over the next 4 years, these core values are fundamental to our work. We're going to be kicking off our implementation phase in January, and we're going to look to these values to ensure our work is in alignment with our mission and those of our partner agencies. Next and final slide, please. Successful projects do not just happen, they are the result of our teamwork. Like you, FTA is committed to improving communities. We just do so through public transportation. As Admiral Reed noted on his slide, reliable transportation is a vital condition for health and well-being. As President Biden has continuously touted, equity is a goal that must be the foundation of our work in government. We know that the vital programs and services of HHS and our partner agencies such as HUD work in concert with our efforts to improve health and well-being for all. And I look forward to continuing our complementary and productive partnership. Again, thank you for the invitation to participate in today's program. Now I'd like to turn this over to Sunil Iyengar from the National Endowment for the Arts.
Thank you so much, Veronica. So I'll just have a few remarks, and then I would like to show a couple of slides at the very end. I hope to convey a little bit about why this plan matters so much professionally to me, but also to the agency as a whole, and to, I believe, our partners, many of whom I hope are on the call today. So I've been privileged to participate in the ELTRR working group and also on a subgroup around measurement. At the National Endowment for the Arts, I serve as director of the Office of Research and Analysis, and the mission of our unit is to apply social sciences research and evaluation methods to making the invisible visible, where the arts are concerned. The idea is to measure and report on factors intrinsic to the US arts ecosystem, but also to elucidate the arts' many societal contributions. Through studies we commission, but also through the research grants we award, we seek to understand and promote the relationships of the arts to economic growth and innovation, healthcare, community planning and development, and formal and informal education. So one of the challenging but also exciting dimensions of this research is how the arts and design are so deeply woven into the fabric of so many other sectors and practices. So it truly takes a whole of government approach to identify policy levers for action at these intersections. This is why, working with the ELTR working group, I've been delighted to see belonging and civic muscle at the core from this vital conditions model, at the core of this model for ELTRR. I think a lot of us from the arts community would say we see ourselves there, but we also have clear examples of the arts' relationship to other vital conditions, such as basic needs for health and safety, lifelong learning, and meaningful work and wealth. And the report really calls out those relationships and shares evidence about those links. Indeed, to quote the report, one of the recommendations is to, quote, integrate arts and cultural programs into core resilience resources across agencies. So that couldn't be, you can't get more visible or explicit than that. And it says specifically to incentivize the integration of arts and cultural resources across agency programs for all vital conditions. So, and I have to say, we've been inspired, those of us at the NEA, by our chair, Dr. Maria Rosario Jackson, who brings her to the table herself, her own expertise in working at the forefront of the arts and community development, including public health. So this is a really nice synergy here. So in brief, it's nice to see the arts called out in multiple sectors as we set the agenda for common goals that can be pursued by local, regional, and national partners, regardless of their original field of practice or expertise. As a research person, I naturally hope this will lead to smarter indicators across these systems, with the arts featured in a suite of measures that can be used to evaluate conditions on the ground in a variety of circumstances, so we don't underestimate the arts' value for individuals and communities. Now, none of this would be possible, I really have to emphasize, without what strikes me as a nearly unprecedented level of receptivity, enthusiasm, energy, listening, and peer feedback among a diverse range of federal partners. This is how this whole process is felt from the inside. A special thanks to Erin McDonald and her colleagues, including the Admiral Reed, who have managed this initiative with aplomb. I know the plan is aspirational, but it models a way of working that I hope the agencies and their partners will take into future collaborations, whether they focus on recovery or resilience or on other concepts or projects entirely. It's not just whole government, it's really good government. And I want to also note that we're very proud and grateful to have so many arts partners in the wings, so to speak, thinking of groups like the National Coalition for Emergency Preparedness and Responsiveness. We've got also a number of state arts agency partners, National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, local arts agencies, and of course, nonprofit organizations and tribal communities, among others. In closing, I know that I've addressed I've just addressed from my own perch at the NEA, why, as an arts and cultural researcher, I see the ELTRR plan as exemplary. But now I want to pivot to the mission of the National Endowment for the Arts in general and why the plan resonates for the core work of the agency. In fact, the words resilience and well-being are even in our very mission statement. The mission reads of the NEA, the arts strengthen and promote the well-being and resilience of people and communities. By advancing equitable opportunities for arts participation and practice, the National Endowment for the Arts fosters and sustains an environment in which the arts benefit everyone in the United States. Not only that, one of our strategic goals is to integrate the arts, quote, with strategies that promote the well-being and resilience of people and communities. So you can check out our strategic plan to see how we propose to do this with new and existing programs. But again, the ELTRR brings us, I think, as Admiral Reed said, shared lexicon and a frame for doing this in conjunction with other federal agencies. And by extension, also our beneficiary communities, applicants, grantees, regional and local partners, and service organizations. Brings them into the federal conversation about how we can effectively and equitably devote resources to long-term recovery and resilience. Finally, let me highlight some ongoing initiatives that, in my opinion, anticipate the spirit of cross-agency, cross-sectoral partnership. Aaron, if you're able to pull up just the 2 quick slides. Yes, so this one just lists a few initiatives where I think they're on their way toward helping with a broad government-wide effort at understanding recovery and resilience and measuring and intervening, so to speak, through programs. We have a task force, an interagency task force in the arts and human development, consists of several federal agencies, many from Department of Health and Human Services, but also from other places across government. And we're actually in the process of rethinking this group and how to make it align with current realities, and also how to, in some ways, we'll be looking again to the ELTR as our kind of playbook for this. We have a couple of initiatives in the arts and health, the Sound Health Network, which is collaboration born out of work with National Institutes of Health and others around music and healing, music and health and well-being. We also provide creative arts therapies to military and service members and veterans and their families, and also do community engagement arts programs, but there's a heavy dose of research and evaluation around this. It's called Creative Forces. I urge you to take a look at that. And I also want to call out a phenomenon in the arts, but really in communities all across the country, known as creative placemaking, where the arts and design are integrated, are really at the core of community planning and design and community development. And this is a grant-making program, Our Town, which is backed by technical assistance resources and for communities, arts organizations, but also community leaders and local governments. And finally, our work with the Bureau of Economic Analysis, looking at how the arts relate to economic growth, GDP, but also gross state product. This is a great kind of diagnostic tool, if you will, for understanding how creative economy is being affected year to year. So these are some of the tools in our toolkit. If you can turn to the next slide. And there is really a window here. I mean, we hear this a lot. I don't want to drum up a sense of false urgency. This is actually, I think, very timely, this ELTR and where we're headed with it. Just from our perch again, from the National Endowment for the Arts perspective, we have, there was President Biden signed in an executive order back in September, which raised the standard in a way for what the arts can do in government. It explicitly says, among other things, that he's hoping that, and they're hoping that through collaboration with our federal partners, we can advance the economic development, well-being, and resilience of all communities. So we really have a remit now and the basis to invest more heavily in this work with you all and our partners. Again, none of this would be possible without all our great colleagues in the field, outside of government, as well as those within government, our staffs and our federal agency partners, not only those who get to be on the call today, but those who have been persisting throughout this year and a half in making the plan a reality through implementation. So thank you all very much. I want to just close by introducing Dr. John Balbus from the Department of Health and Human Services from the Office of Climate Change and Health Equity. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yangar. And I know we're running a little bit late, so I will jump right in and try to compress my comments as much as possible. Admiral Reed started us off with a few rhetorical questions, and I'd like to start with a rhetorical observation that is about the intersection of health equity, climate change, and the equitable long-term recovery and resilience framework. And that observation is this: there are coincidences, and then sometimes there are things that seem to be coincidences but aren't. So there's the coincidence of the COVID pandemic and a string of weather disasters that have occurred in the past 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, however you want to count, that are more fully attributable to climate change than ever before. The pandemic itself sparked the long-term recovery and resilience initiative and the recognition that our communities and our health systems were not as resilient in the face of pandemics as we had thought. The climate crisis has also demonstrated that our communities and our health systems are not as fully resilient in the face of extreme weather events, as those events themselves have become more widespread, repeated, and severe than previously. But in addition to the lesson that we're not as protected as a nation as we thought, COVID has repeated the lesson that some of us are much more and some much less protected from shocks, and that the dividing line between the two groups is more often than not drawn by historic and structural deprivation of social determinants of health, which are in turn related to racism and environmental and economic injustice. And so it's not a coincidence that the dividing line is drawn in precisely the same way between those who are suffering more from the health impacts of climate change, whether we're talking about heat waves, massive floods, or wildfire smoke. People who are living on coastal reservations that are being eroded and lost to the sea, people who are being exposed to wildfires and the smoke from them, people who are living in urban or rural floodplains, whether that be in Texas or Detroit or Brooklyn or Kentucky, they all need the vital conditions for thriving that the ELTRR is bringing to us. They all need humane housing, thriving natural environments, economic justice, civic muscle, belonging, and I would probably add to that list more reason to trust government. These conditions are all essential for human health in the face of the climate crisis, and they are all elegantly laid out in the strategic framework for the ELTRR. Our Office of Climate Change and Health Equity recognizes the fundamental importance of improving the social determinants of health, or if we want to use different terminology, of enhancing the vital conditions for our primary mission of protecting the health of people in the United States in the face of climate change. And we also recognize that the current national response to climate change, as embodied by the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, with its emphasis on massive spending programs for civic infrastructure to enhance community resilience, that this current national response to climate change affords enormous opportunities for improving the social determinants of health and health-related social needs, to use a different term for the same thing. So much so that we've identified optimizing the health benefits of climate spending as a priority focus for the office. One of the ways we're trying to make this happen is at the hyperlocal level, which is where all the action is, where we're working in close coordination with our regional HHS and other agency partners to support the integration of health and human services into the growing models of climate resilience hubs. Now, the primary model of resilience hub we're building on comes from Kristen Beja, the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, who's envisioned a community-designed and managed physical facility, a brick-and-mortar facility that provides year-round community services, mostly related to the social determinants of health, and then doubles as a source of shelter, electricity, clean water, and food in an emergency setting. The year-round provision of community services is an enormous opportunity for an ELTRR-framed all-of-government approach to community thriving. And the operational functions provided during emergencies by these hubs to communities that are already characterized by deprivation of social determinants is exactly where climate resilience can meet health equity. The integration of health services wasn't part of the original definition of these resilience hubs, but many have incorporated them, and our office, again, is working with regional interagency partners to expand pilots that are coming up, including one in Sacramento, California. These models of resilience hubs are functional, operational models of the blending and braiding of federal resources, and their success will depend on achieving what ELTRR and so many parts of the federal government are working on now, easing the access for communities to these applications, reducing their complexity, the true collaboration among federal agencies. And Admiral Reed in his comments described this as the philosophical shift that we need. The twin crises of COVID and climate change have broken down many of the divisions between and within the health world. This also means some unique changes in thinking, and our twin crises have broken down the divisions between, for example, public health and healthcare, with Medicaid waivers funding public health interventions, for example. Our office of Climate Change and Health Equity is working with CDC, with the Administration for Security and Preparedness Response, and Center for Medicaid, Medicare Services to try to integrate more fully all the different components of the nation's health resilience ecosystem, specifically local health departments and local healthcare system preparedness efforts. And in the case of environment, this philosophical shift that we need is is moving away from a past where the story has been not just separation, but within HHS of compartmentalization of environmental health with provision of environmental health mostly limited to specific sections of CDC and NIH. I'm hopeful, I'm actually optimistic that this framework and the people who have put it together can be the hub of a new approach, of a holistic integrated view of human health and the environment that uses all of the levers available to be sure that not just our infrastructure works, not just the cars aren't stuck in traffic, that the trucks get through, that you know, that the pipelines don't leak, but that all of our regulatory and community investment activities all contribute to the health of people in the United States and to the thriving of our communities. And with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to Becky Payne from the Ripple Foundation, who will take us to our close.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Aaron, Paul, all of my other colleagues for including me. It's wonderful to be back among you. I want to start by also thanking Tyler Norris, Monty Roulier, and Bobby Milstein, because they were my partners in crime in those early days when I picked up the phone in March of 2020 and said, we need help. This is bigger than government. And they answered the call and led so many of you on this call and many who aren't with us through the exercise to develop the springboard and really set the stage for the kinds of work, not just what we produced, but how we produced it. So I want to make sure we acknowledge them. Go ahead to the next slide, Aaron. A lot gets said about what this moment calls for. It was certainly a moment when I picked up the phone and called Monty, Tyler, and Bobby. And I think that that is really poignant to think about. There are multiple moments that happen over time when there is a leadership call, a call for stewards to join together and affect change. But there's also a risk in thinking about these times as moments, these repeat crises, which we know we will experience, the long food lines we saw, the loss of jobs and economic instability. It risks that we think about this as a one-time event, that we will fix it and be done. Or it risks thinking that the problem was a one-time event. We started the ELTRR, that interagency work group, in a moment when we were reflecting on what we were seeing across the country. In many communities, the failed systems were falling apart before a virus arrived. It was not COVID that was causing the inequities that were flooding our communities. It was the recognition that there were decades of failure on the part of government, civil society, and many other leaders across sectors to invest in the kinds of things that we knew would have produced equitable well-being and resilience, the kinds of things that are called for in the Vital Conditions Framework and in the LTRR. It is more than a moment, and I would just want to make sure that as I speak to my former colleagues in government and my civil sector partners, that we recognize that we will continue to need to make choices, repeated choices, daily and yearly, that will transcend administrations and budget cycles to heal through legacies that brought us here and choose differently so that we can leave a different legacy for our grandchildren. We are at great risk of considering that this is on the cycle of an administration or a strategic planning cycle that will be solved in a matter of 2 or 3 or 5 years. It is a 20-year, a generational endeavor that we are about. Next slide, Aaron. So this single notion that was elevated and brought forth in the springboard about as systems collapse, people rise, explains so much of how this plan came to be and what we need to continue to do. It explains how we can come together to transform failing systems for the better. It explains why belonging and civic muscle is at the center of all that we do. And we circle back to that as an incredibly important capacity in the design of each of the other vital conditions. It also explains why a group of committed career officials born out of frustration and not wanting to be a part of returning to the way things were, the way those systems had been designed that resulted in so much pain and suffering, came together and slowly over time, not through official channels of asking for official formal appointments of political officials, but through our networks, through our relationships, we identified like-minded individuals who were thinking and understood if only we could do things differently. We could come together and craft an ambitious plan. We didn't know how long it would last or where it would take us, but we had to try. We had to come together and try to rise up and elevate different approaches and different solutions to the problems that were facing us in spring of 2020. Next slide. I also want to leave you with the notion that has been raised by some of my other colleagues that we can think about measurement structures. We can definitely think about the bureaucratic approaches and the need to foster money flowing to communities and how we structure that. That's all necessary and important. But resilience at the end of the day is expressed in our communities. Yes, by individuals, but the strength of that resilience is most impacted by the strength of the relationships that are forged, not in the time of crisis, but in our steady state, normal day-to-day interactions of knowing who you can count on, who you can come together and problem solve with, understanding each other's assets, understanding what each group or individual or community organization brings to the table. And that was the nexus of the conversations that we started with. We didn't start by, give me your laundry list of federal agency actions that you want to see in this plan. We said, let's have a conversation. Let's actually understand what each of our agencies does in service of our communities, not in times of crisis, but the billions of assets and resources that we are all responsible for bringing forth day in and day out, outside of a crisis, that we can choose differently with given authorities without asking for a penny more in funding. How could we work differently to help expand and exploit the impact, the potential impact of each of our agencies? Next slide. Those relationships will continue to be incredibly important. And in those dark moments when so many of us can feel like we're going it alone, I think it's really important to make sure that we make visible that this is without a doubt part of a bigger movement. My colleague, Bobby Milstein, has done incredible work to very quietly be an observer of all of the different groups and entities that are contributing to this thriving together ethos. We think it's really important as students of social movements to recognize, one, that no one group can control or manufacture a social movement. They are their own animals moving forward as an organization in the world. But we can recognize that there are specific things that need to be built and present in order to really qualify as an enduring and long-standing social movement capable of the transformative change that we're looking for. So we have very informally mapped what are those functions you would expect to be present and who is taking part of them. I think it's important so you can find each other. It's also important so you can recognize none of us are doing this alone. They're courageous acts of daily leadership to encourage your peers and your colleagues to choose differently. However, they are also less courageous and less frightening when you know you are surrounded by this broader community that is all pulling in the same direction, lending each of our strengths and assets to the table. And as we foster those relationships and continue to have conversations about what we are each doing, how we bring our strengths and don't compete with each other, we will continue to push forward and bring this idea of all people and places thriving to close with little gap. I am certain of that. I want to go ahead and end on a call to my colleagues in the federal government and each of you in civil society. Erin, next slide. And remind you that the recommendations are what they are. They are recommendations. Implementing those recommendations with fidelity to the intent will not happen without everyday courage to adopt and maintain a new mindset. The vital conditions does not reflect agency titles, agency structure, or silos by design. It is about recognizing there is a place and a role for all of us in service of a common goal to return government to our communities and return government in service of people, particularly those who have been suffering the most. It is only through adopting that new mindset, building our relationships and building our muscle to work together differently that we will see those new results that we're all striving for. Erin, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Becky. Thank you all for your remarks, and thank you all for your presence with us as we take this to close. I'm going to really quickly, just one more minute, share where we're going. So we're hoping to keep the conversation going from today. You heard that we are focused on a number of different efforts to continue to move the work forward. Some of those are visualized here on the screen in terms of building dialogue with all of you and others that you think would be aligned to this work and have the appetite to really lean in collectively. Supporting implementing bright spots, both across the federal government and with partners outside of that space, and then deepening our learning collectively about where we want to go. Finally, I will say really importantly, our call to action today collectively is to come back for conversation. So please take a look at the web pages that are alive and available. I will share that out again with all of the resources from today. Please take a look at the tools that we have available, including the asset mapping of federal government resources currently that are aligned with the vital conditions. And we will be providing updates and expanding what's available to those tools. So please stay tuned and come back and partner with us in building out what that looks like as valuable resources. And then please reach out to me for conversation. I will absolutely make sure everyone has my contact information, but we hope to deepen what we started here today and continue to really understand, as Becky and all of our other leaders offered, what it looks like to continue to build this work together and how we can collaborate effectively and share what we continue to do in the federal landscape to support this work. So with that, I will leave you with our mission for this work that started as a starting point around the intention that continues today around the vision for this work and what we all know that we can achieve in very clear terms, aspirational, but also operational in terms of what we want to see happen for all people and places. This is my contact information. I will again share this out with all of you. I have been corresponding with you all. And with that, thank you for your time. For those that have been able to stay with us, have an incredible holiday season. And if we don't talk to you before the end of the year, have an incredible start to the new year and be in touch. Paul, do you want to say any final last words?
I'll just say happy holidays too. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you all. So appreciate you. Be well.